Hello, my name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, and this is Pints with Aquinas. In this episode, we're going to talk about whether atheists can be saved. Sometimes you hear people say things like, well, they can't be held responsible, or they're certainly not culpable, or their ignorance is invincible, and it seems like all you have to do to make it into heaven is not know enough, which is crazy. So let's get after it. All right, so as is our custom in these videos, we want to receive the principles and then rehearse the arguments so that way we can think well about the issues ourselves. And when you're talking about faith discourse or theology, those principles are just what God reveals, so Christian revelation, because we believe that God speaks and that he makes us capable of receiving that revelation. So revelation seems to admit the possibility of damnation. You can consult the sacred scriptures, the church's tradition, and both speak to this possibility. The scriptures, often in parables, like Dives and Lazarus, one makes his way to the bosom of Abraham, the other to a place of terrible suffering, and there's an untraversable chasm between them. Or you can think about, like the mention of Gehenna. It's better that you pluck your eye out and cast it from you, or cut off your hand and cast it from you, and that you make your way towards heaven maimed, as it were, or dismembered, rather than be cast bodily into Gehenna. So the stakes are high. Or you can think about the scripture's mention of the wailing and grinding of teeth, which awaits those who are cast out from whatever setting. So like the man who shows up at the wedding without the garment, he's been pulled in from the highways and byways, but he hasn't made himself, as it were, well disposed or well prepared for the wedding banquet. Or you can think about the parables that come at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, like the 5 prudent virgins and then the 5, as the Greek says, moronic virgins. And having to go buy their oil and come back to the wedding feast, they're locked outside. Okay, so maybe the clearest one would be the parable of the sheep and the goats, who are divided on the basis of their visiting mercy upon those poor and lonely and lost and whatever. However, they're described there in that particular passage, and Christ identifies with those who are in prison and stand in need of visits, or those who are sick and stand in need of healing. So those who attended to Christ in his distressing disguises merit heaven, and those who did not merit hell. This point is clarified by the Church's tradition in her doctrinal pronouncements. Oftentimes it comes into the conversation regarding predestination, which the Church revisits at a variety of points: Second Council of Orange, Council of Kiersey, Council of Valence, certainly in the Council of Trent. And you'll hear it said that if you go to heaven, it's by God's predestinating grace. If you go to hell, it's by your choice against that grace. So we're free. The Lord has placed our life in our hands. God desires that all be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. We read in 1 Timothy 2:4, but the possibility of failure, of defection, remains, because we can choose. So that's the Church's revelation, but then we think of that revelation, or we process that revelation in our own cultural setting. And there are cultural moments when this revelation seems less tolerable to certain thinkers, whether Christian or otherwise. And I think it's just a good reflection that we can have here is what am I reasoning upon when I think about this issue? Because we should be reasoning upon revelation rather than just reasoning upon our intuitions or our experience, which have a certain validity, but I would say a relative validity. Because, sometimes you hear people introduce their experience into the conversation as if it were infallible, when we know that is not the case. So you'll hear some 20th century thinkers almost explain hell away. Now, I'm not going to do justice to his theory, but certainly Karl Rahner, in his theory of fundamental option, he'll teach that I can affirm my belief and my love of God even while doing things contrary to that faith and charity, because it's more basic, it's more fundamental, but it becomes kind of strange and dichotomized. And then I'll talk about anonymous Christianity, where one can pertain to the church by a kind of unschematized or unreflected, belonging, when it's just not clear that is the case, or that coheres with the truth of the matter. And certainly the way that his theory was applied, it led to just lack of fervor when it came to the proclamation of the gospel, and lack of making use of those means which God appoints for our salvation, like the sacrament of confession. So I think just as an initial point, we're agnostic about the particular fate of individuals. We don't assign people to hell with certainty, unless you're Dante. But even then, we hope for the salvation of those who have gone before us in death, and we commend them to the mercy of God, but we also don't entertain magical thinking just because it would make us feel better, okay? So then, all right, let's get into it and think through some of these distinctions, some of these further distinctions, so that way we can advance in the discourse. So when we talk about an atheist, there are a variety of things that this particular word, or a variety of people that this particular word might kind of capture. So you have non-theists, which are people who don't really engage with the question. It's almost as if they're innocent of theistic claims, right? So it's not like a, tried and found wanting, or a did and subsequently rejected. It's just like it's a non-engagement, which I think we see more and more of. And then you have agnostics who engage the question, but without a resolution. Okay, so it's like, yeah, all right, but then genuinely doubt, which is to say they're caught between two opposing positions, not inclining to one or the other. And then you have the atheist, who I would say, in the strict sense, is the person who engages the question of religious belief and rejects the religious option. So this third one is the most problematic because it represents a kind of intellectual or volitional obstacle to belief. And I would also add, just by way of addendum, that there are practical versions of each of these. So these would be like speculative stances, what I just described, but then there are practical versions of them. Like some people just live as if, without ever even like thinking about this particular question. Okay, so then what would it mean then for an atheist to be saved? Well, what does salvation mean? Because that's what it means to be saved, is to profit from, to enjoy salvation. So salvation is it's the protagonist of salvation is Christ. So if one is saved by Christ in his church through faith and charity, which would be like those interior principles which apply Christ's grace through the church and sacraments to our lives. So it's always going to be Christ's. It's always going to be the church's. It's always going to be the sacraments, which are moving and operating in our lives if salvation is to be applied. We can also have confidence that God gives enough. God gives each a grace sufficient for salvation. All right, that doesn't mean that everyone is necessarily saved. It means that he affords a grace sufficient to salvation. And God strings his graces together so that often when we, enjoy a particular grace or profit from a particular grace, there are other graces that will come in its wake. Not in that we've made those graces to be efficacious in our life, but God shows himself generous, it seems, in a kind of pattern, with what St. Augustine will call prevenient graces and consequent graces, but kind of like a grace daisy chain. So God is giving enough, and he's giving us grace through a variety of different means, right? We can even speak about the natural law as giving a kind of grace, like the way that St. Paul describes it in Romans 1 and 2. We have to be careful there, so don't take that out of context. Just read those first two chapters. And then we can think about the grace mediated by the Old Covenant and then by the New Covenant. And you'll have, Christian authors expanding upon what St. Paul says in his letters that, if it's, the only way by which a person can come to knowledge of God, we even believe that God would appoint special missions to persons who live way far off from Christian civilization and wouldn't encounter the gospel message otherwise, like ministering angels. So God's going to make himself known, and he's going to make himself lovable to all persons of all times. It might be more difficult for some and more easy for others. The point is not for it to be fair. The point is for it to be available and for us to incline to it. And I want to emphasize the point that if we are saved, it's not just saved by being quote-unquote good people who don't kill anybody, as you hear sometimes kind of said of those who make kind of weak use of the sacrament of confession and just say I'm basically fine. I'm just here for you to tell me that I'm basically fine. It's like, no, we have to grapple with our sins, our vices, so as to heal and grow beyond them. And another point is, if you are saved, we're not saved by ignorance. I mentioned this at the beginning of the video. It's not sufficient to say I didn't know enough, right? I wasn't responsible. I wasn't culpable. I have invincible ignorance. You are not saved by nothing. You are saved by something. Now, there might be reasons for you to be less responsible, less culpable, and for your ignorance perhaps to be invincible, but that doesn't mean that you're saved by your ignorance, all right? It's always better to inform yourself. It's always better to grow your mind and heart on the way to God. So then what is required, or what is asked? St. Thomas focuses especially on this verse from Hebrews chapter 11, specifically verse 6. And he says, "And without faith," this is the author of the letter to the Hebrews, "and without faith it is impossible to please him is God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him." So St. Thomas kind of schematizes this, that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. He associates that with the existence of God and the providence of God. And then he maps that onto the two most basic revelations, or two most basic beliefs, as it were, or articles of Christian faith, which are the triune God and the incarnate Lord. So it's obviously super important to know the triune God and the incarnate Lord, because this is the by whom and the for whom of revelation and grace. This is the God from whom and the God unto whom we are called by revelation and grace. And so that's just what we mean by salvation. So you need to know from whom and for whom in order to actually participate consciously in this saving event. So St. Thomas will say, before the coming of Christ, the great ones had, those who were saved had an explicit knowledge. The lesser ones, they had an implicit knowledge. And in the current dispensation, we're required, or we're expected to have an explicit knowledge of the triune God and of the incarnate Lord. There might be certain circumstances in which you might imagine an implicit knowledge would be sufficient. But basically, we're called to know and we're called to love. And we're called to be drawn into this drama of salvation. So, in this time, when the proclamation of the gospel has advanced to the point that it has advanced to, I think there's a real responsibility, because more people are capable of having explicit knowledge of the triune God and the incarnate Lord, which St. Thomas will say kind of sums up the creed. He'll sometimes say the creed is divided into 14 articles or 12 articles, but he says you can kind of group them all together or class them under these two headings. And so this is the faith. This is the substance of the faith, is to know God and the Christ whom he has sent for our salvation. And an atheist, the third one that I described above, who is chosen against, who has consciously cut himself off from, is posing obstacles, right? Posing impediments to this encounter with God. God's going to always be trying to break through. So Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange says that at every moment, of every day, God is offering even to the most hardened of sinners at least the grace sufficient to pray, which doesn't mean the grace of justification, but it means a grace, a kind of actual grace with which to begin or upon which to build. And so an atheist who is cutting himself off actively from this is cutting himself off from salvation. All right? So that just seems like the straight read of the situation. So we can't just hamper our efforts by a kind of wishful thinking which says, well, maybe it'll come by some other means. It might come by some other means, right? But maybe we're those means. We might, in fact, be those means. Not because God needs us. God could do it by any way he saw fit to do, but because God wants us to be implicated in the drama of salvation for our good, for his glory, and our salvation, and the salvation of those to whom we are sent. So I don't think we can indulge a kind of wishful thinking, all right, to, quiet our anxieties or smooth over our otherwise troubled minds. God's mercy is powerful. It is indeed powerful, and we commend all persons to the mercy of God. But part of commending all persons to the mercy of God means to ourselves be protagonists in that commendation. So it means a real evangelical acting, which means proclaiming the gospel, which means praying, and which means, whilst commending, also mediating the mercy of God to those whom we're sent. So can an atheist be saved? Yes, but by your proclamation of the gospel and by your mediation of his mercy, which is to say the mercy of God. But on its own terms, we just don't know enough to pronounce further. So that's what I wanted to say. I hope that you have profited from it. Please do subscribe to the channel. This is Pints with Aquinas, so click subscribe, push the bell, get sweet updates when other things come out. Also check out Godsplaining. We had an episode called Extra Ecclesiam Nullus Salus, which is about this particular issue, and you might find that helpful or fruitful for kind of growing in your knowledge of the issue. But that's a podcast that I contribute to with 4 other Dominican friars. We also have some retreats this summer and fall, which you're most welcome to, cordially invited. So check out details for that at godsplaining.org. Another cool event that's coming up, and maybe I'll just make this my last announcement, is the Dominican Rosary Pilgrimage, which is taking place on September 30th in Washington, D.C. at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. It's just going to be like a big, awesome rosary-a-thon preacherama. So I'm giving a couple talks, and some other Dominicans whom you know are also giving some talks. So you'll meet people there from Godsplaining and the Thomistic Institute and other things besides, and it's going to be awesome. So check that out at the website. Just Google Dominican Rosary Pilgrimage. Okay, know of my prayers for you. Please pray for me, and I'll look forward to chatting with you next time on Pints with Aquinas.